Okay, so we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff today. The question of whether the U.S. could ever actually face a civil war. It's a question a lot of folks are asking these days, and honestly, it's a bit unsettling to even think about. But, understanding history can give us some clues about the warning signs. So for this deep dive, we're going to take a look at what actually causes civil wars, and we'll see if any of those factors are at play today.
Sounds a little intense.
It is, but hey, that's what we're here for, right? To tackle the tough questions. So to guide our deep dive today, we're turning to a conversation between historians Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook. They host a podcast called The Rest is History, and they had a fascinating episode about, well, exactly this, the factors that lead to civil wars. And to bring it all home, we'll be focusing on how their insights apply to the U.S. today.
Yeah, that's a smart approach. I mean, history can seem so distant sometimes, but when we see those connections to the present, it really hits home.
Exactly. Okay, so Holland and Sandbrook kick off their discussion with the collapse of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, which was just, wow, what a chaotic and brutal situation. A modern
Wow.
nation, seemingly stable, and then just boom, descends into this horrific violence.
It's unsettling, right? And what's even more unsettling is that it happened in Europe, a place that, we often think of as the pinnacle of modern democracy. And it happened fast, too. That speed of disintegration is what should really give us pause.
Yeah, that speed is definitely something to watch out for. If things start to unravel really quickly, that's a big red flag. So thinking about the U.S. today, one thing we might want to consider is how fast the political rhetoric is escalating.
Right. Are we seeing a shift from healthy debate to something much more hostile and dehumanizing?
Exactly. And that makes me think about another point Holland and Sandbrook brought up. Yugoslavia was formed from the remnants of empires, the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. So it was a kind of like this artificially created nation. And that lack of a shared history, that kind of inherent instability, might have made it more vulnerable to this kind of unraveling.
Interesting point. So you're wondering if the U.S., with its own unique history, might face similar vulnerabilities.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've got our own deep divisions, right?
Yeah.
Racial inequality, economic inequality. Those are some pretty serious fault lines.
You're absolutely right. And that leads us to another really important point that Holland and Sandbrook make. They challenge this simplistic narrative of ancient hatreds as the root cause of these conflicts. They argue that it's too easy to dismiss complex situations by saying, oh, those groups have always hated each other. It's just their nature.
Right, like it's some kind of inevitable outcome.
Exactly. And they point out that this idea of ancient hatreds was actually a political strategy used by the Clinton administration. It was a way to justify inaction in the Balkans.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's like if we believe these conflicts are rooted in ancient, intractable hatreds, then there's nothing we can do to stop them, right?
Exactly.
So why bother getting involved?
Yeah, and that brings us to a chilling example from the Spanish Civil War.
Oh, yeah. Which, by the way, happened even though Spain has centuries of history as a unified nation.
Precisely. But it still saw incredibly brutal neighbor-on-neighbor violence.
It reminds me of that story from Paul Preston's book, The Spanish Holocaust. He talks about this landowner in a small village who basically orchestrated the murder of his fellow villagers. And he did it in this gruesome mock bullfight. I mean, it just sends chills down my spine thinking about it.
It's a horrific story, and what makes it even more terrifying is that it wasn't driven by any clear religious or ethnic divisions. This guy just turned on his neighbors, fueled by political ideology.
So it really shows how these deep-seated hatreds can emerge seemingly out of nowhere and incredibly fast.
Exactly, and they're often fueled by political manipulation, propaganda, the dehumanization of opponents.
That's a crucial point to keep in mind when analyzing the current political climate in the U.S., right? It's not just about pre-existing differences. It's about how those differences are being framed and exploited.
Absolutely. So here's a question for you. Do you see any parallels in the language being used by political figures or media outlets in the U.S. today? Are certain groups being demonized or dehumanized in ways that could potentially lead to violence?
Hmm, that's a tough one. I mean, it's definitely something to be aware of. I think if you constantly hear that a particular group is a threat to your way of life, it's easy to start seeing them as the enemy, even if you don't have any personal experience with them.
And that's how this kind of hatred grows exponentially. It feeds on fear, propaganda, the constant reinforcement of this us versus them mentality.
And then, of course, you throw social media into the mix with its echo chambers and algorithms designed to keep us engaged.
Which really just amplifies these extreme viewpoints.
It makes you wonder if all this negativity and outrage online is a sign that we're, teetering on the brink of something much worse.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. Yeah, it's a lot to process, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, we've talked about how quickly a seemingly stable society can just fracture and how dangerous political rhetoric can be, even when there aren't these like deep historical grudges.
Yeah, it's starting to feel less like ancient history and more like a cautionary tale for the present.
Exactly. And Holland and Sandbrook, they go on to talk about how people can get caught up in this wave of violence, even if they don't necessarily hold those same extreme views.
So they're not like hardcore fanatics or anything. They're just kind of swept along.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
They talk about how many people who lived through the Yugoslavian and Spanish civil wars later said that they weren't particularly political or driven by hatred. They just kind of got caught up in the tide of events, if you will.
Wow, that's kind of scary.
Yeah.
It's like you think you're immune to that kind of manipulation, but then you realize that maybe we're all susceptible under the right circumstances.
Right. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these historical patterns, not just for understanding the past, but for navigating the present.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we resist that pull toward division?
Well, Holland and Sandbrook point to an interesting example from the UK, their concept of Her Majesty's loyal opposition.
Oh, yeah, I heard of that.
It's kind of brilliant, isn't it? It acknowledges that dissent and debate are healthy for a democracy, but it also emphasizes respect for opposing viewpoints, recognizing that even your opponents have legitimate concerns.
So it's not about everyone agreeing all the time, but about having a framework that allows for disagreement without resorting to violence.
Precisely. And Holland and Sandbrook argued that this system helped to de-weaponize British politics. They even suggest that the U.S. might be missing this kind of pressure release valve, as they call it.
Well, we've definitely seen a decline in civility and respect in our own political discourse. It's like we've lost the ability to disagree without demonizing the other side.
And that's a real concern. They worry that this extreme polarization and delegitimization of opponents in U.S. politics is creating a dangerous vulnerability.
Okay, but don't we have safeguards in place to prevent someone like Slobodan Milosevic, who intentionally stoked those ethnic tensions for his own gain, from rising to power in the U.S.?
Good question. And Holland and Sandbrook address that directly. They point out that the U.S. has a very different history and political structure than the U.K.
Yeah, for example, our relationship with guns is unique. The sheer number of firearms in circulation here makes any potential for civil unrest that much more volatile.
Absolutely. They emphasize that widespread gun ownership is a huge factor to consider when analyzing the risk of conflict in the U.S.
And then there's the military. In the U.K., it's traditionally a political right. But here in the U.S., the president is the commander-in-chief.
And that's a crucial distinction. They argue that having a president who directly controls the military creates a point of vulnerability, especially if that president were to, say, refuse to accept election results.
It's kind of a chilling thought, right? Especially when you think about that story of Lord Mountbatten being approached to lead a coup in the UK back in the 1960s. It shows just how quickly things can go from stable to terrifying when the military gets pulled into partisan politics.
Precisely. And that brings us back to the present team. Holland and Sandbrook point out that many of the preconditions for civil war, things like deep political polarization, distrust in institutions, economic inequality, easy access to weapons, are already present in the U.S. today.
Yeah, and we've seen a rise in political violence in recent years, too, with things like the January 6th attack on the Capitol. It definitely feels like the potential for things to spiral out of control is very real.
They're concerned about that, definitely. They see the delegitimization of the electoral process, fueled by misinformation and conspiracy theories, as a particularly alarming trend.
Yeah, I mean, if people completely lose faith in the system, then what's to stop them from resorting to violence? It feels like we're on this, dangerous precipice. It's a scary thought, but they emphasize that recognizing these dangers doesn't mean giving in to despair. It's actually the first step towards finding solutions.
Okay, so what are those solutions? Where do we go from here?
Holland and Sandbrook offer some ideas, but they also bring up another factor that could complicate things even further: climate change.
Wait, climate change. How does that fit into all of this? Okay, climate change and civil war. I'm trying to see how those two connect.
Yeah, it's not an immediate link, but they're saying that as we see more extreme weather,
Yeah.
more resource scarcity, mass displacement due to climate change, all of that, it creates this breeding ground for conflict, especially in areas that are already struggling with social and political tensions.
Right, so it's like climate change isn't the sole cause, but it's like a threat multiplier.
Yeah.
It just makes everything worse, makes those existing problems explode.
Exactly. And they actually go pretty far with this. They say these climate-driven conflicts could be way more devastating than the kind of civil wars we've seen in the past.
Wow, really? Why is that?
Think about it. If whole regions become uninhabitable because of climate change, where do those people go? Who gets the resources that are left? Those questions, they lead to conflict, almost inevitably.
It's like we're taking all the stuff we've already talked about, all those risk factors, and then just adding this whole other layer of instability on top of it. It's a lot, honestly. It gets kind of overwhelming, you know? Like, what are we even supposed to do with all this information?
Oh, Guy, it's heavy stuff. But it's important not to just shut down or give up. Remember, just by being aware of these risks, we're already taking a step in the right direction.
Okay, but awareness alone doesn't solve anything, right? What can we actually do?
Well, Holland and Sandbrook talk about that too. They stress the importance of strong democratic institutions, promoting tolerance and understanding, addressing those root causes of inequality that we talked about earlier.
So those are big picture solutions.
Yeah, they're systemic, long-term solutions. But they also say individual actions matter too.
So it's not just about voting or donating to the right causes. It's about something more than that.
Yeah, it's about being active in your community, calling out harmful rhetoric when you see it, building relationships with people who might have different views than your own.
It all comes back to that human connection, huh?
It does. They argue that these small acts of connection, understanding, those are the things that can actually help to prevent societies from breaking apart.
So even though this deep dive has been kind of scary at times, I do feel a little bit more hopeful knowing that we have some agency, that we're not just powerless in the face of all this.
Exactly. The future isn't set in stone. We get to help shape it.
So for our listeners, I think the biggest takeaway is this: stay engaged, stay informed, and don't underestimate the power of just connecting with other human beings, even the ones you disagree with.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive for today. See you next time.